to NURFM 103.7. It's kind of coincidence that our chat with our Professor of Politics, Dr. Jim Jost from the University of Newcastle, lines up on Budget Eve. And Jim, what are we, Budget 2022.0 or 0.1? Is this second one for the year? Good morning.
Yeah, good morning, Mark. Yeah, look, it might seem a little unusual because we're talking about this as a major budget rather than what would normally be the case around November, early December, usually around November. We have a mid-year economic forecast. It's not quite a budget as such, but ever since they've moved the budget cycle to the big budget being announced in May, 6 months later they do, if you like, an economic stock take of where they are at. The government looks at where they're at in terms of what they projected in May. So this budget time would have happened anyway. Under the previous government, they would have done a bit of a reset, etc. What's happening now is that because we've got a new government, we've got a series of, shall we say, economic challenges that we're facing. The new government, when it was elected, had a series of promises that it needs to begin filling out and trying to get successfully in place. At the same time, it's also dealing with a major economic downturn on a global scale that could have serious repercussions. So this budget now becomes, instead of just simply being a mid-year adjustment, is both an attempt on the part of the government to reset the Morrison budget that had been put in place and to readapt that to suit the government's election promises. So that's the main purpose, and what Mr. Chalmers has to do tonight is map that out in such a way that it appeals and pleases as many of the stakeholders as possible.
All right. Now, if we can leave aside for one moment we're no longer funding this project, we're going to fund this one over here, because with all of that, we know there would be winners and losers, and they are discussions that, of course, will happen, and see what happens electorally down the road for that. But there are other things that were said, when the new government came in, and it was all about the cost of living, which, of course, it's the only game in town. Are they in a bit of trouble here with this one? They could either get this very right or get it very wrong, because we're hearing now that power prices, potentially 30 to 50% increase, and the big promise was the $275 back in your power bill. I checked mine last month, Jim, it never happened. That may very well be a noose around their neck down the road, but let's see what they may have a crack at getting right too.
Just two quick things on that, Mark. First, they never promised that it would happen overnight, and I'm not trying to defend the government, but it wasn't going to happen overnight, and they projected that out into around about 2024 or thereabouts. The second point is that it's just one of a number of areas, and whether they can get that one right, I think we noted a couple of weeks ago that putting a dollar figure on it was probably a higher risk, because promising to bring them down is one thing. Specifying how far they will go down or what cash benefit will come out of it is another. But I think the political point that we need to sort of move back to here is what Mr. Chalmers delivers tonight will give us some indication of the political dynamic of the Labor Party in government, of whether it's still stuck in the 20th century and thinking like a 20th century Labor government, or whether it's moved itself securely into the 21st century, has shaken off some of the neoliberal shibboleths in economic terms, that simply cutting spending is the answer, cutting taxes is the answer. We know that that's not worked and hasn't delivered what its supporters have promised, and we certainly saw...
That's a tough call to get across electorally, though.
Of course it is, but cutting taxes at the high end, etc. Now, we know that they've got a dilemma over stage 3 tax cuts, and I suspect that the government will stick with them because the opposition has made it an issue of trust, or tried to make it an issue of trust. That's one dimension. But speaking of the budget of the whole, it's needing to set the political parameters for the next 12 months to 2 years to secure the government's consolidation, as it were, of particular promises, particular projects, and to ensure that, and I think this is the other dimension, whether they're making decisions on the basis of the nation, on the national scale, on what's best in the national interest, or whether they're continuing the cronyism dynamic that was very much characteristic of the previous government and to some extent of some past Labor governments as well. So the question that I would be sort of looking to see answered tonight, perhaps, is has the new government learned its lessons from what's happened in the past, both with the Rudd-Gillard era, but also with the 10 years of coalition government, that the sort of economic policies that seem to prevail no longer have that leverage. So whether they've now are able to put in place new thinking around priorities. And by that I mean we keep hearing a lot about manufacturing and sovereign manufacturing capacity and stuff, and all of that's very important. But when we think about manufacturing, it only employs a very small section of the population. The biggest slice of the population are employed in the services, the caring services, the education services and so forth. And these are areas that we know need extra support, they need growing, and they need the workforce to be upskilled. And this is one of the areas I think where the government will try to put some priority. But whether it does this in a way that sort of hampers itself by imposing cuts in areas where it's going to please some people but not others, it's sort of that's a big question, and the answer is not entirely obvious. But spending money on infrastructure that builds the services areas and the services industries where most people are currently employed, looking after and trying to protect the jobs of those people, in particular people in casual employment, which seems to be the big growth area in employment, whether the government is able to capture what's needed for that, or whether it's going to simply pay lip service to it and then look forward to the May budget where it takes out the axe and starts, chopping through many of the programs that it's currently got in place. At present, it's got a bit of a windfall happening, so the deficit is going to be far less than what was predicted in May. I think it's close to half of that deficit will now be gone because of the increased revenue. The other dimension to that also is that they're able to pull away some of the empty or hollow promises of the previous government that put huge amounts of funding into various areas that haven't yet started and were, shall we say, less than productive in terms of what they were going to achieve. They were more about shoring up electoral support than they were about sound economic management at the time. So they've got a bit of leeway there, Mark.
Well, look, we'll see what happens. I know all of that. The stuff at the end there is, this area versus that area, and those debates will just would have happened anyway. This is a big chance for them to try and prosecute a case, maybe to try and set the scene of page one moving forward. Whether they can do it, we'll have to wait and see. The next little while we'll learn a little bit more. Jim, as always...
It's their political roadmap for the next couple of years.
Got to get it right.
Yep. And, thanks, Mark.
When you put petrol up, when you haven't got anywhere near the electricity bill, they've got to get this other stuff right. You've got to give some people to champion them about, otherwise, could be a short run. Yes,
it'll be interesting to see what the political forecasting is that is embedded in the economic decisions that they're about to lay out.
There he is, our Professor of Politics from the University of Newcastle, Dr. Jim Jose, on 2NURFM 103.7.
A broadcast service of the University of Newcastle.